Hello and welcome to another episode of Threat Update. I'm Kilian Englert, and joining me today is Ryan O'Boyle. Ryan, how's it going?
Hey, Kilian, doing well. Thanks for having me on again.
Awesome, thanks for being on. So, day in and day out, Ryan, I know that we're always following the security news, and it's almost inescapable the amount of information and ransomware attacks we see in the news. And we're always having people sort of come to us and ask, what can we do about it? And I want to run this by you, Ryan. I don't know if this is controversial, but I want to put a theory out there that in situations where someone gets hit by ransomware, by the time that it detonates, it actually starts encrypting files, it might be too late. Because as we face these bigger, more organized actors, the groups doing it or the nation states running it, they're oftentimes in an organization for days or weeks or months, finding data, collecting it up, and exfiltrating it before they even get to that ransomware portion, before they announce their presence, really. So I wanted to pick your brain and see if there are any suggestions or tips that you have from your investigations that we can provide to the audience how to spot these things sooner.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look for some of the early warning signs.
Sure.
Just from past experience, a big thing that we tend to see is, indication through brute force attacks. And they start to work pretty iteratively. We'll start to see those evolve over time. Generally, we'll start to pick them up at the most basic attack layer, which is more of like the account enumeration. Attackers are guessing
Right.
usernames. They're trying to guess usernames and passwords. They're generally starting with very generic lists, things that look very common. And then over time, they're going to start to get smarter and tune those lists a bit further. And they get different error codes if it's a correct username versus an incorrect username. So they can start to build out a list of actual users, and of course, use other recon methods like LinkedIn and other sites to try to find legitimate emails and legitimate usernames. So I think trying to identify these things like brute force attacks and account enumeration and some of these external exposures early on is one way that we're really going to help protect ourselves from these down the line or downstream
Right.
ransomware attacks. If they're able to try to brute force us, it also indicates that there's some sort of exposure, externally. So I think that's a big thing to look for.
That's true, and that's a good point. I didn't actually realize until we started talking about this, about the different error codes. So it's pretty important to be knowledgeable about this because the attackers can gain a lot of information without having to tip their hand too much, I suppose, especially as you said, if they're using lists of account names or passwords from other breaches. And we keep seeing, again, in the news, the treasure troves of passwords and accounts that keep getting released. And if you're curious if your information is on there, I recommend checking out Have I Been Pwned? That's a great resource for looking that up. I am always in there looking to make sure every time I see a new drop. So it's a good bonus tip, I suppose. So Ryan, I did want to get into the details because I know we're going to get asked this. In terms of how you go through and look for this information, what you have to do to configure Active Directory, for example. What are some of the steps? I know we have a guide on it, but I'd like you to walk us through it just a little bit.
Sure. Step one is really, I think, making sure that you have the right level of logging.
Sure.
One of the most common attacks that we see is the end-to-end brute force attack. So
Yeah.
using end-to-end authentication to try to brute force a domain.
Right.
End-to-end authentication, somewhat legacy, a bit older, but for most organizations, it's still out there. It's almost always used,
Right.
To some extent at least. So not only having at least a basic level of logging around authentication activity, looking at both successful and failed authentications across the domain, but also having more of an advanced level of auditing, especially
Right.
around something like legacy and DLM authentication, I think is essential. Turning on something like the capturing of 8,004 event IDs across your domain
Right.
controllers, at a minimum, allows us to start to identify things like the secure, channel name. This is where we
Right.
can start to see, if we have an exposed device or an exposed server, where are attackers potentially exploiting like an open port on it.
Right.
And we've seen this come from quite a few different areas. Sometimes it's as simple as a VM that gets spun up in Azure or some sort of other cloud infrastructure that maybe is slightly misconfigured and has some open ports like RDP. We've also seen, and you and I have talked about this in the past, a big shift as people have been working more remotely,
Right.
having insecure home Wi-Fi networks, and maybe they don't necessarily have the right firewall settings set up, or
Right.
they're bypassing their firewall settings by linking directly into their modem.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have something like an endpoint level firewall enabled across the domain, or if it's bring your own device, we could be just as susceptible to these types of attacks. So, really the key here is making sure that we have the right levels of logging and auditing designed around things like authentication activity, and making sure that we have things like advanced auditing turned on for some of these legacy authentication methods. They allow us to identify and remediate these brute force attacks and these early warning signs pretty quickly and pretty effectively.
That's a great point. Just as we were talking a little bit, we do have a great blog, as I mentioned, on this that goes through all of the details, all of the steps you go through, where you sort of start within Varonis, and then how you turn those advanced auditing levels within AD itself. And I was just scrolling through a little bit. Please, audience, don't try and read this. We'll link to the blog. It's an eye chart even for us here because there's a lot of information. But that's really helpful. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing that. And thank you for taking time out to join us today. I know it's a little bit different than your normal topics. You've been doing a lot of cloud-focused stuff lately, so we're bringing you back into the ransomware game. I hope you didn't miss it too much.
No, of course not. But truly, we're here to help. And if anybody has questions around the audit policies, configuration, give us a shout. We'd love to jump on a session and work through it together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate your time, Ryan. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider giving us a like or subscribing to the channel. And of course, please leave us a comment. Ryan and Kyle and I always read those. We always enjoy your comments. And sometimes we even respond to them either on YouTube or LinkedIn or live on a video. So again, thank you, Ryan, for joining. Thank you all for watching. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care.
Thanks all.